On today's episode, I want to take you inside my design, write, and sell framework that I've developed that really forms the basis of my entire design process and pattern creation process. It also forms the basis of my program, Quilt Design Code, as well. And this is on purpose, right? In last week's episode, I covered the first stage of this framework, the design, write, and sell framework. So we looked into design. If you haven't listened yet, go back and take a listen as I walk you through all the important design phase elements of coming up with a unique design for a quilt pattern. In this episode, we are going to be getting into the details of how to write the pattern once we have our design worked out.
Welcome to A Creative Odyssey. I'm Ryde. I'm a designer, an entrepreneur, and online educator obsessed with all things design, quilting, and creative business. Whether you're a seasoned quilter or you're just starting out, whether you're passionate about design and textiles, or whether you're a creative business geek who loves to nerd out on all the moving parts that go into making a creative business thrive, you are in the right place. I'm excited to share insights from my creative odyssey with you as I navigate design, creativity, and growing an online business on this journey as a creative entrepreneur. Are you ready to explore the possibilities of design and discover the world of creative business? It's time to embark on a creative odyssey.
Now, you might be a beginner quilter who's really passionate about finding a way to get more from your new hobby. You might be an advanced quilter who is looking for a new challenge to take your quilting to that next level by building a business or really getting deep into the nitty-gritty of designing your own quilt patterns. You might even be a service designer and you're looking to stand out in the market. You want to develop fabric designs. You want to differentiate yourself into a specific niche, such as quilting as well. So this is the right place to be in. Welcome to A Creative Odyssey. Let's jump right in. I'm Ryde. This is where I can help you to start to follow this design framework that I have come up with, this design, write, and sell framework around creating unique quilt patterns. As an engineer, I'm a designer, I'm a maker, I'm an entrepreneur. I've taken a whole lot of paths to learn the skills to design, write, and sell unique quilt patterns. I am going to be covering some of the biggest questions I get about writing a quilt pattern, including which software to use. So make sure you stick with me to the end here. I'm going to be sharing about that and about so much more, some of the details that people don't really talk about when they come to talking about writing quilt patterns, things that are a little bit off the beaten path. So stick with me here. If you're not already subscribed to the channel or to this podcast, now is a great time to do so you don't miss out on any of these upcoming episodes where I'm going to be going into further detail about this design, write, and sell framework. Next week, we're going to be looking at how to start selling our quilt patterns. For now, let's take a closer look at this write phase of the design, write, and sell framework. I'm also going to be sharing a guide with you so that you can dive even deeper into each of these steps as we walk through them. So make sure you stick around and give this a whole episode a listen. So this second step is about writing. We want to create a professional document that becomes the cornerstone offering of our creative business. We've gone through that design phase. We've come up with our unique quilt pattern design. And now we want to really write the instructions that are going to take our followers, our customers, the people who have purchased our quilt pattern, we're going to take them through from the beginning to recreating your amazing quilt design. So we have this design, we know what sort of size and scale we're working at. It's really time to start mapping out our quilt pattern. So you want to think about your quilt pattern, really fundamentally what it is, it's a really clear set of concise instructions that you're writing down for somebody else to be able to follow step by step so that they can reproduce your design. Now, it's important to take the time to really think through how you're going to explain those pattern steps. What makes the best sense? You kind of want to step back and have a bit of a think through your entire pattern. The way that you go about sewing something, is this the way that would make sense to somebody else sewing this pattern as well? So think about that a little bit too. Something that I think is really important to think about when you are writing your quilt pattern is, who are you designing this quilt pattern for? Who are you writing this quilt pattern for? Is it a beginner quilter? Is it somebody with more advanced quilting skills? Considering what types of skills the person who's going to be making this pattern has already, this is going to help you make a decision on how detailed of an explanation you might need to include in the pattern. Are you going to include instructions for simple 2 at a time half square triangles, and you're going to go into detail on that so that people can get really the most precise half square triangles they can? So pitching for a beginner quilt pattern, a beginner quilter, for example. Or are you going to propose, like, let's say, for example, the 8 at a time half square triangle method, which might be a little bit more challenging for a beginner quilter to get the precision that they need on a larger size block like that. So starting to think about who you're designing for, who are you writing this quilt pattern for, it's going to allow you to start making decisions about what to include in your quilt pattern, how much detail to go into in each of the different steps as well. Thinking about what it is that they're going to need to know to be able to execute this pattern with precision and come up with a great end result, which is also going to mean that they're going to come back to you for future patterns as well. So thinking about that repeat customer who's going to be coming back to you as well. Something I like to think about, and this is kind of like, I guess, an ultimate end goal, is to think about things like instruction sets that you get from IKEA, for example. I think most of us have had an experience of purchasing some IKEA furniture and putting it together ourselves. Think about those instructions. They are only pictures. There are no words in IKEA instruction booklets. Thinking about that means, okay, a picture really is worth 1,000 words. Is there a way that I can explain this step in a series of pictures versus a whole paragraph of text, which might be a little bit overwhelming for somebody? Can you say it with a diagram? Can you use less words? This is something that I always like to kind of challenge myself with when writing quilt patterns as well. And just as a little add-on to this as well, I'm Australian. My first language is English. I do live in Italy though, so I am aware that there are plenty of quilters in Italy whose first language is not English, who might struggle with reading a whole lot of instructions in English. And for them, having a detailed instruction set in pictures, like a diagrammatic set of instructions, that's going to help them and encourage them to think about purchasing your pattern as well. You know, I think about my mother-in-law. She's a really avid knitter. She loves to go on Ravelry and browse all of the different patterns and things like that. But unfortunately for her, a lot of the time, those patterns are written in English only, and they don't include a lot of diagrammatic instruction. So I do spend quite a bit of time with her as well. She might download a pattern and we go through it and do a bit of translating and things like that. But I just want to tell you that story just to give you a little bit of a perspective outside of where you are in your place in the world. So if your first language is English and you're going to be pitching to English-only speakers, fantastic. Write your pattern in English by all means. Go ahead and do that. If you are thinking, hey, I really would like to make my pattern accessible to people who might be outside of the US, who might be outside of English-speaking countries, then think about how you can create your pattern so that those people can also have the benefit of your amazing design and be able to recreate your design by following through the diagrammatical instructions that you can give them as well. So that's just a little bit of that. This is kind of like the stage where we want to be thinking about all of those instructions that we're going to be creating for somebody to recreate our quilt pattern. And right now, what I want to talk about a little bit as well are those elements of a quilt pattern. Like, what is it that actually goes into a quilt pattern itself? There are kind of a set number of elements or sections to a quilt pattern. And I'm going to link you below this video or below in the show notes for this podcast episode. You can get a hold of your very own guide, 7 Steps to Grow Your Quilt Pattern Design Business. And inside that guide on page number 10, there is a checklist of the elements of a quilt pattern. If you don't have this guide yet, make sure you head to aliryde.com/guide so you can grab your copy. And you'll be able to find this checklist in there as well of these elements. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through these elements. If you've got your guide there, bring it out. You can start to make some notes on that page. Or if you're already ready to jump in, use this as a checklist to mark off all of the different elements of your quilt pattern too. So we're going to start out with our cover page, the very first page of our quilt pattern. This is where you're kind of showing off your quilt pattern to the world. You are either using a digital mock-up of your design. So if you've designed your quilt pattern on a computer program like Adobe Illustrator or in any other kind of program that you've designed it in, you can use a digital mock-up there. Another great way to go about this is to actually sew your quilt pattern, which also allows you to test the quilt pattern and create your cover quilt. So this doesn't mean you have to like spend months and months and months hand quilting it and all those kinds of things like that. You can always just sew the top without making the quilt sandwich and without quilting it all together and binding and finishing it completely. Just have that quilt top there. Get a fantastic photo of it with some beautiful natural light and you can then crop that photo down and use that as your cover page photo as well. You want to include your title, probably your name or the logo of your business, maybe what level this quilt pattern is pitched to, whether it's a beginner or an advanced or an intermediate quilt pattern, what finish sizes you've included that, as well as any contact info or hashtags you'd like people to use to share about their quilt pattern online. Next up, we want to include pattern notes. Now, people might be thinking, well, what do I really need to include notes about my pattern? I'm not really sure what to write here. What I mean by pattern notes is you want to include a little bit about your pattern. And this is something that comes into play as well when we start to think about who it is that we're designing our quilt for, who it is that we're writing our quilt pattern for. These pattern notes are a great way for you to share more about the design inspiration behind your quilt pattern and to really be able to create a connection with that audience of people that you would like to connect with, your customers, your clients. Think about two patterns, okay? One is kind of like, generic half square triangle pattern number 1 over here, and the other one is Garden of Wonders half square triangle quilt pattern, okay? Already in the naming, one is a little bit more interesting than the other. But in the pattern notes for the generic kind of half square triangle, there might be something like, okay, this is a beginner friendly half square triangle pattern where you will learn how to use half square triangles. Okay, great. Yeah, very descriptive. It's pretty clear what it's about. What if in those pattern notes instead, I included a little bit more about the design inspiration that goes into this quilt pattern? This quilt pattern is inspired by the colors of my garden here in Italy. I've taken elements from the olive trees, the wildflowers, and the jasmine that I can see blooming in my garden. Already a little bit of information there about how the designer has used some inspiration to come up with this quilt pattern design. You're allowing your audience more kind of connection points with you. You're allowing them to start thinking about, olive trees in a garden in Italy and wildflowers. And maybe I can find some wildflowers in my own back garden that I can use to inspire me for the color palette for this quilt pattern. So you're already giving somebody a little bit more information about what they can expect from your quilt pattern and create more connection with it. So this is kind of part of that telling of story where we want to invite our customers, invite people into the design process of our quilt pattern so that we can create a connection with them. And that really helps us to stand out as well in the market too. All right, next up in these elements of a quilt pattern, we are looking at things like definitions, where we want to define what our seam allowance is. Is it a 1/4 inch? Is it a scant 1/4 inch? Is it a different seam allowance if you're including any kind of different seam allowance in there? What are the assumed fabric sizes? Are you assuming that everybody is using 42-inch wide width of fabric that's usable, or are you assuming that they're using 44, 40? You need to include those things in there so that people have an idea about what are the assumptions that you're making about the quilt pattern as they come into it. What are you assuming that they understand about the calculations that you've included in your quilt pattern? Then we're moving into the fabric requirements. And this is kind of like the big picture overview of how much fabric somebody's going to need to create your quilt pattern. So for example, for a throw size quilt, it might be something like, 4 yards or 2 yards of backing fabric, or 1 yard of fabric A, half a yard of fabric B, half a yard of fabric C, those kinds of things. These kind of big picture overviews for the amount of fabric you're going to need to create your quilt pattern. Then we're getting into some more detail in the cutting directions. This is the next element. Cutting directions are all around including the specific sizes and the number of those pieces that you'll need to cut out from the fabric for creating the quilt pattern itself, okay? A lot of people include this in a table, which is awesome. Some people also like to add, in addition to that, a kind of like you would find in a garment sewing pattern where you see the fabric itself and then laid out on the fabric you see where the pieces are cut out of it. Now this is particularly useful if you have quite a tight fabric allowance, like there's not a lot of overage included in your fabric requirements. And it's also very useful if you have kind of odd shapes. Say, for example, you're creating an applique pattern and you have some kind of more organic shapes. You might want to show people how they can lay this out on the fabric to get the most amount of pieces out of the fabric with the least amount of wastage as well. So this is our cutting directions. Then we move into the block assembly. Here is where we get into writing those instructions really step by step. how are we going to sew the elements together to create the quilt itself? This is where we're thinking about those diagrams. We want to see if we can say as much as we can with pictures and as less as we can with words. So the least words, the most number of images. We want to really try and explain the steps in a visual way. Ultimately, I think most quilters are probably quite visual people, so this makes a lot of sense here as well. Yes, you can include those written steps as well, but try to think about including everybody by explaining things with a diagram. A picture often is worth 1,000 words, right? So this is where you're going to step through those different elements of how to create the block itself or how to put together the quilt. And then specifically, we want to look at the quilt assembly. That's our next element where we're going to be putting together these blocks. We're going to be assembling them together in columns or in rows. How do they all fit together? You're giving somebody a really big picture overview of how everything goes together so that they can finalize the quilt top. You might like to include some finishing instructions as well, how to go about binding the quilt, how to go about creating the quilt sandwich, how to go about piecing together backing in case you have a larger size quilt and a single piece of fabric is not going to be enough. And then really what you want to be thinking about is the coloring page as well. That's something that a little bit of a bonus that you can include at the end as one of the elements as well. So this is a page where you can invite people to engage with your design by coloring in their own version of the quilt and trying out a few things before they jump into cutting fabric and sewing the quilt pattern itself. All right, so that's about the elements of design. I know I covered a lot here. Head to aliryde.com/guide. You'll be able to download a PDF version of this, and you have literally a checklist there of the things that you can check off here. So what elements go into creating a quilt pattern? So make sure you grab hold of that guide and you will be on your way to creating your very own quilt pattern. All right, so kind of like the next part of writing the quilt pattern, we've kind of got our instructions down. Talking about creating these diagrams. Okay, well, how do I create the diagrams? I want to let you know that I do this digitally. I create diagrams using the software that I use to create my quilt patterns. So I use this software to design and often also calculate part of the calculations for my quilt pattern. And I also use it to create all of the diagrams that I then use to put into my quilt pattern to explain the steps of how somebody can recreate this design. And the software that I use is Adobe Illustrator. This is the software that I use. I created a whole episode on why I choose to use this software. So I'm going to link to that. You'll see a little link here to be able to go and check that episode out if you're here on YouTube. If you're listening in on the podcast on your favorite podcast platform, make sure you check out the show notes because I will include a link there to that episode so that you can go back and listen to that as well. All right, so we have created our instructions. We have gone through our checklist of the elements of a quilt pattern, what's going into our quilt pattern. We have created the diagrams that we're going to need to do that. Our next step is to lay all of this out. An essential part of growing any business is presenting a professional product to your customers. Okay, so this is where we are creating a professional PDF document that becomes this digital asset, which is our download that we can then sell to somebody. And that is a fundamental element of our creative online business. Okay, so this part is all about laying out that quilt pattern. You can use a whole lot of different programs to do this. I hear from people all of the time that they really struggle using something like Word to create their quilt patterns. I hear you. I understand that those programs are not necessarily made for creating your quilt pattern. You can, by all means, if you've got access to Word or Google Docs, you can start to create your quilt pattern in those programs. The program that I use is Adobe InDesign. This is the professional standard for graphic designers. It's used to create professionally laid out documents such as magazines and booklets. This is what I use to create my professional quilt patterns. Do you have to start out here? No, not necessarily, but it's something that I do recommend you have a look into. Again, check out the episode that's linked here, all about why I choose to use the Adobe suite of programs. That includes Illustrator, where I create all my diagrams and design, and then I use InDesign, Adobe InDesign, to do all of the laying out of my quilt pattern. Okay, if you don't want to use InDesign, you can look at something like Canva as well, or even PowerPoint or Google Slides. That's another way that you can create a layout, probably a little bit more easily than in Word, but definitely not, as far as I'm concerned, at the level that you can create in Adobe InDesign. All right, so really what we want to do is we want to create a logical layout. We want to leave enough white space around our instructions. We want it to be really clear what those steps are that people can take through our quilt pattern. It's essential that your quilt pattern is written with these clear, concise instructions, okay? That layout is legible, that any fonts that you choose to use are really easy to read. I know we are very tempted. We're all visual people. We're designers. We love a pretty font. We love a really different font, those kinds of things. Fonts are fantastic, but they are only useful if you can read them. So make sure that when in doubt, you choose legibility over everything else that you choose when it comes down to choosing the types of fonts that you want to use for your quilt pattern. This could be for the headings. This could be for the body text, any of those kinds of things. Make sure you use a legible font. Okay, that's really the underlying lesson from this part here as well. So in this stage, we are taking those diagrams that we've created, we're taking the instructions that we've created, and we are laying them out in our professional document. We're going to create a PDF from this, and then we can start to use that as our digital asset. So that kind of rounds out the write phase of this design, write, and sell framework. I'm going to be diving next week into the next phase of this selling phase. How do we start to get our quilt patterns out there into the world in front of our customers? How do we start to sell these things, right? We've got our pattern down. We've come up with a great unique design. We know what goes into writing a professional PDF pattern. And now we want to look at how we can get that out into front of people. I know there's been a lot of information in this episode. If you'd like to see it all written down, like I mentioned, head to aliryde.com/guide. Get your copy of this PDF guide, 7 Steps to Grow a Quilt Pattern Design Business. It covers all of the things we talked about in this episode on writing your quilt pattern. It covers those things that we talked about in last week's episode on design. And it also goes into the sell framework as well, which I will be talking about on next week's episode. So don't forget, I will be going deeper into each of these steps across these episodes. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything at all. Make sure you check out the show notes for any of the links to other episodes that I've referenced here as well. And finally, I would just really like to invite you to take some action after listening to this episode. Grab that guide, aliryde.com/guide, download it, print out that page, which is the elements of design, and start to work through them one by one. It's a checklist style. There's even a little box that you can check off there. Print that out so that you have a reference for what it is that you can work through step by step as you are writing your quilt pattern. All right, I am going to see you again very soon. But before I go, what I wanted to leave you with was just a little bit of an idea about how this works in real life. You know, a lot of people that I hear from, they can come up with a design. They love to design things. They get to that stage where they're really full of energy and enthusiasm. They've got a whole lot of stuff down on paper, sketches, things like that. And then I hear from a lot of people is they don't know really where to start to translate that idea into something else. The 7 Steps guide that I've been referencing throughout this episode, this is going to help you by knowing what elements to include in your quilt pattern. That means you're already taking those next steps with your quilt design and turning that idea into a reality. You know, this is where you start. Design, then write, then sell. I had a student, Alison, when she came into my world, she had a really big passion for her quilting. She was extremely frustrated, though, with how to make that passion into something more. She had all these amazing ideas. She just didn't know what those next steps were to take her ideas from paper into something more. When Alison started with me, her passion was just about all that she had. She didn't have even a laptop that she could use with Adobe Illustrator to start writing her quilt pattern digitally. I have to say, I am always in awe thinking about Alison and her story. Her resourcefulness and her determination have really driven her from somebody with a passion and an idea on a paper to a woman on a mission to build her own quilt pattern design business. Alison really made it happen. She is on fire. She's transformed her passion and ideas into reality. She's launched her first applique quilt pattern. She's already working on her second quilt pattern right now. Alison, who started out with no laptop, if she can make this happen, what's possible for you as well, you know? I hope that you've found some great insights in these last episodes. I've broken down that design phase for you. Here we are in the right phase of creating a professional quilt pattern. Stick with me as we continue to build towards that sell phase as well. And in the meantime, whip out that 7-steps guide, start planning out each of those elements of your quilt pattern, and start to write it down. All right, that's it for this episode. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the very next episode of A Creative Odyssey. In the meantime, stay curious and keep creating, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.